All right, welcome to Roots of Reality Experiences. Today I'm joined by Dr. Christopher Federico, who is a professor of political science and psychology at the University of Minnesota and is the president of the International Society of Political Psychology. His research focuses on the nature of ideology and belief systems, the psychological foundations of political preferences, and intergroup attitudes. So, Dr. Federico, thanks for coming on today.
No problem.
So, when did you first get interested in political psychology?
Roughly in the mid 1990s when I was finishing up college. At that time, I had a general interest in politics and society, and I spent some time trying to kind of figure out what angle to study that from. And ultimately, I discovered political psychology in part through working in the lab of a scholar who was then at Berkeley, a guy named Tom Tyler, who studies the processes that make people judge political authorities to be legitimate and entitled to deference, essentially. I was very taken with that question and its broader implications for society, and I just kept on pursuing it. My interests have shifted a little bit since then, but the general interest in what psychological factors allow people to adjust themselves to or resist certain political systems and states of affairs has been sort of the longstanding interest of mine.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, I mean, I feel like political psychology is a field that not as many people have heard about. So, what are some of the major things that you regularly study then in this field? Obviously, you have a particular focus, but like in the big picture, what is political psychology as a field then?
In the big picture, political psychology is interested in how the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of individuals are influenced by political institutions, political structures, political events, and what have you, and vice versa. So, what is the interface between sort of basic psychological processes that human beings have and the political environments, political decisions, political actions they need to take?
Great, cool, okay. So, how does your research then sort of what have you learned about why people choose to vote or why people choose not to vote? Then, obviously, it seems like voting is something that is kind of hit or miss in terms of whether someone does it or not. The voting turnout rates are not exactly high historically, though I guess it depends on what one considers to be high or not. But
Well, this is a question that political psychology and the study of political behavior has focused on a lot at large. Personally speaking, I haven't done a lot of work myself directly on the question of what differentiates voters from non-voters. I have done some work on some psychological factors that relate to that. Two factors that have kind of popped up in my own work, but certainly not the only ones that matter, are what you might call political engagement on one hand. And when we say political engagement, we're thinking of something separate from whether or not people actually vote, write petitions, sign petitions, or something like that. We're talking about two main things. One, how much do you know about politics in terms of factual information? And number two, how interested are you in politics? So folks who are more engaged in politics in that sense, they're more likely to vote, of course. They're more likely to know what they're voting about, and they're more likely to think that voting is something significant that they should do. Another kind of closely related to variable that's popped up in my own work is something that my students and I have referred to as centrality of politics to the self. So, besides being interested in politics or knowing more or less about politics, people can consider their political attitudes and beliefs or identities as more versus less important to their sense of who they are. For some people, being a Democrat or a Republican, a liberal or a conservative, or this or that, it's very important to their sense of who they are. For other people, it's almost completely irrelevant. They would think of themselves more as a Minnesota Vikings fan or a Green Bay Packers fan or some other group identity of that sort. So people kind of differ in the extent to which politics is central to their identity. For people who it is central for, they're more likely to vote. So those are two factors that have kind of popped up in my own work. But there's a lot of other stuff out there that matters. And those include personality factors, includes things related to trust. I can talk a little bit about those if you would like.
Yeah, definitely.
So really, there are a variety of things. I'm a political psychologist again, so naturally, I've kind of focused a lot on sort of what are the underlying psychological processes, what are the variables that sort of operate at a lower level as opposed to a systemic level that lead people to vote. Not that those are necessarily more important in any normative sense, but they're just the ones I study and that I can speak most authoritatively about. So there are a couple of things there besides the two variables, I've discussed already. So besides simple engagement or knowledge or centrality of the self to politics, another factor that really matters a lot is trust. And there are two ways to think of trust here. Number one, do you trust other human beings in general? And number two, do you trust government and related institutions? So Congress, the presidency, the courts, and things like that. All other things being equal, people who are generally low in trust in other people, and in particular, low in trust in government and political institutions, they are less likely to vote. They're less likely to think that it's going to make a difference, that it's going to be efficacious in changing anything or bending the direction of the polity in one's preferred, direction, essentially. So trust matters. At a sort of micro psychological level, another thing that seems to matter a bit is personality. So, I don't know how many other sort of psychologically inclined researchers you've talked to on here, but when psychologists who study personality think about differences among people in their basic personality traits, they kind of use a framework that is known as the Big Five. And the Big Five, or the five factor model, as we call it, sort of boils variation in human personality down to five dimensions. So, openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and what is sometimes called neuroticism. Two of those traits seem to correlate pretty reliably with whether people vote or engage in other forms of political action. And those are extroversion, so the extent to which you kind of enjoy social interaction and lots of contact with other people, and openness to experience, which is essentially an individual difference that assesses the degree to which you like to experience new things, encounter things of an intellectual or creative nature, and what have you. People who are highly open, people who are highly extroverted, they are more likely to go out and vote and be active in ways. So it matters how much you trust the system and other people. It matters what your own traits are. Another sort of basic idea that pops up a lot in the psychological literature on voting is this notion of voting as a habit. So a habit in general is something that we tend to do because we've done it a lot and we are kind of used to it. It's something that comes easily to us versus other things. Well, the way a lot of people who study political behavior think about voting is that it's just another kind of habit we develop. The more often you've done it, the more easy it is for you going to be able to do it in the future or in any other opportunity that you have to vote. So what this means is that people who've not voted a lot in the past, or perhaps more importantly, who've not had the opportunity to vote in the past, they're less likely to vote on any one occasion in the future. So this kind of has some implications for, where people are in the life cycle when they tend to be highly engaged voters versus not so engaged voters. Obviously, if a person has just turned 18, or even if they're just in their early 20s, they've had fewer opportunities to go out and vote in previous elections simply because of their age. For that reason, voting is less of a habit for them than it will be for people who are older or further along in the life cycle. So, voting is a habit. We get the feel of it. We get used to what's involved in doing it and what steps you need to take and how you have to kind of think your way through the process and act your way through the process. And the more times you've had to kind of develop that habit, the more likely you are to vote on any one other instance, so to speak.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think there seems to be plenty of reasons why someone may or may not vote. I've kind of always gotten the impression from just people I've interacted with that I know that do not vote that I feel like for younger generations, especially like the college age, people were like maybe it's just not cool to vote. Like it's kind of this cool thing to take a like a no side approach to politics, and it's like oh politics all sucks, and kind of be disengaged in that way. I feel like other people are just like they don't care. You know, they've never voted, they never thought about voting. It's just not something that interests them. And then I think there are people that are politically interested in what goes on in the country, but maybe they don't think their vote matters, or maybe they think like the candidates are like equally bad, and so it's better just not to vote at all.
Well, you've touched on a couple of things that are very significant to how political scientists, in particular, think about, whether or not people are going to vote. One is sort of what's sometimes referred to as rational ignorance. One thing that people who model human behavior in an economic fashion who demonstrate it over and over again is that for any one given individual citizen, there is usually no interest or utility to be gained from taking the effort to learn about candidates and vote. So any one person's vote is not going to make enough of a difference to sort of motivate them in some economic or self-interested sense to go out and vote. So that's an argument that's been made a couple of times very famously, yet people do vote. But the importance of that point is that is it really that weird that there's some subset of people who don't vote? Voting requires effort. There are opportunity costs to voting, to learning about candidates, and a lot of people would rather spend their time doing something else than thinking about politics. So, that's sort of the context here. But again, people do overcome that propensity toward rational ignorance, so to speak. But more broadly, if we do look at mass politics, we find that there are a lot of people for whom politics is either not very interesting or actively aversive in some sense. So, one thing that was famously said about the level of knowledge and engagement with politics is that it has kind of a low mean, a low average, but high variability, lots of differences among individuals within the population. And to some extent, that's true, though the last couple of cycles, because of the perceived stakes, there's, been, somewhat of an uptick in participation. But historically, what we found is that there are a lot of people who just don't care about politics. They don't bother to learn about it. They don't know much about it. And there are a lot of other things that, for very justifiable reasons, they think of more, their family, their jobs, and what have you. So that's, just kind of a fact of politics. Another thing is that people actively don't like, or at least some people actively do not like the content of politics. A lot of people in particular do not like the conflictual nature of politics. This has always been the case to some extent. When you ask people what they think about different government institutions, the one that they almost always hate the most, year after year, is Congress. Well, what happens in Congress? People debate things and they disagree about things, and they kind of snipe at each other, or at least that's the way it's seen. So people, so to speak, don't like to see the sausage made part of democracy, so to speak. The sort of conflictual, debate-oriented part. It's sort of uncomfortable for a lot of people. And that's something that's very generally true. But the other thing is that we have seen this enormous increase in polarization, or what we call affective polarization, in the last 20 or 30 years. Democrats and Republicans dislike the other party a lot more than they used to. And you can talk a lot about all the different reasons for that, whether, for example, the Republicans have kind of radicalized and Democrats are reacting to that, whether partisanship has become to overlap with a lot of other social divisions and what have you. But the fact of the matter, the immediate fact of the matter is that there is sort of greater political animus in the sense of disliking the out party more than in the past. And that just kind of ratchets up this feeling of discord and competition and conflict that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And one part of that is there are actually what political scientist Ryan and Krupnikov call, the other divide. So one divide is just the left-right divide or the Democratic versus Republican divide. That's the one that we all kind of focus on a lot. But the other divide is between people who are quote unquote deeply involved in politics versus everyone else. So people who are deeply involved, they live and breathe politics. They think about it all the time. Politics is kind of a highly engaging hobby for them. They also talk about it all the time. As it turns out, most people are not deeply involved, and a lot of the people who don't fall into the deeply involved bucket, they really don't like people who are deeply involved. They don't like to be around people who are going to talk about politics all the time, get in political arguments, and what have you. They're quite uncomfortable with that. And to the extent that becomes a bigger part of politics, just yelling at each other or experiencing sharp disagreements, even if those disagreements are substantively or normally important, some people are turned off by that. And that can kind of cause people to pull back from various aspects of politics.
Yeah, no, that's definitely something that seems to be playing out quite a bit today, with all these people kind of politically disengaged to a certain extent. Does that concern you at all then about a country that you have this democratic system and you have a large amount of people that just don't want to be a part of it, and then that kind of fills there's kind of a void that's left where the people that are super involved in politics who may or may not have good intentions then have kind of a greater power because so many people are not participating in the process.
That's certainly a possibility that can occur if we do know that in general, as engagement increases, investment in different competing political identities increases. So the people who are most likely to participate are the folks who are going to be the most quote unquote polarized, or the most likely to disagree with one another, or the most ideologically constrained, so to speak, in their preferences. Another thing that kind of goes along with being more engaged is what we call moral conviction. When you say that someone has moral conviction about an issue, a party identity, or an ideological position, what that means is that they connect that identity, that issue position, or whatever it is, with their deepest moral convictions, with fundamental values, with basic beliefs about the difference between right and wrong. And when that kind of moral conviction becomes a part of your beliefs and your identity and what have you, you're less willing to compromise, you're less tolerant of dissenting viewpoints and what have you. And that just kind of feeds back into the mix. And then again, there's this other group of people that are kind of more on the sidelines, not completely on the sidelines, but less directly involved in politics, who see that and they think, I'm not going to have anything to do with that. So there is this potential for a dynamic where, the most actively involved people are the people who are kind of, most likely to butt heads, so to speak, or to pursue, in some cases, not all, fairly radical steps in terms of how they engage in political competition, as we saw in, say, January 6th, or some of the maneuvers that the Trump administration engaged in on the way out.
Sure. I think it was like the last election, the engagement rate for voters was higher than most years previously. Um, does that suggest then that people are starting to get a little bit more involved in politics as the political polarization kind of increases a bit? That people feel like it's like you can't get away from it, and so more people are having an opinion on it?
I think there's been a sense in which people become more and more aware of the stakes.
Okay.
Especially after the 2016 election, people realized that, things like Donald Trump getting elected really can happen. And, when that's the case, when people are highly aware of the stakes, they're more likely to get involved. And, another part of that is simply political communication that occurs within parties and within political communities. So, one example of that, not the only one, is, say, take conservative media, Fox News and other sorts of institutions of that sort. One thing that, those media institutions do a lot of is to kind of make people alarmed that such and such thing is going to be done by your political opponents if they're allowed into power, if they're allowed to continue, and what have you. So there's this constant ratcheting up of the stakes or the perceived stakes. And, I think that's kind of a part of what's likely to make people more versus less engaged.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Um, when I guess then one thing I'm curious about to get your take on and sort of understanding how this process works in people's heads, because you just mentioned that people are starting to become more aware of the stakes and that we have candidates that have fairly different views on how they would run the country. So how do people then make these sort of claims in their head that the candidates are equally bad, or as if they're like they have very similar or the same type of game plan, or their game plan is both so atrocious that it's not worth voting for either one of them. You can't decide. I know there's always, I feel like every election cycle, there's some quote that sort of circles around where people will talk about how like sort of both sides are evil and therefore they don't want to vote or something like that. Do you know much about sort of what's going on there then?
Well, there are a couple of things that could be going on there. One is to circle back to what I mentioned earlier about trust. There's a subset of people in an American democracy, but almost any mass democracy that simply do not trust various government institutions or the political system more broadly. They think most actors in it are corrupt. They think the structures do not work well. They think the institutions are flawed in some way. And when you kind of have that general attitude toward the political system and its affiliated institutions, you're, more likely to see all actors within that system as bad. So I think, just generalized lack of trust is one place that comes from. There are other things though. Again, remember that I mentioned, amount of attention to politics, engagement, information. In general, if people don't know enough or don't know that much about the differences between the parties or aren't that interested, in general, way this is politics is going to look to them is just, really, two groups of people in society that are not them yelling at each other or being in conflict or being obnoxious or whatever you want to call it. And so, that can lead to this, a pox on both of your houses orientation. And that also kind of links up with what I was saying about the quote unquote other divide, the divide between people who are highly engaged in politics and everyone else. Those folks in the everyone else bucket, they're just not as invested in a lot of these conflicts and experiencing Democrat or Republican as a central identity as other people. So I think it's easier for them to kind of step back and say, well, yes, Democratic leaders and Republican leaders are very different from one another, but I'm also different from both of them in that, I don't care about politics as much as they do. And, I'm not thinking about it as much as they do. And they're talking way too much about it.
Yeah.
So, that's another kind of sense of mutual distance that can go there. Another thing is, well, what are people's actual political beliefs out there? You don't want to present or depict people who are less interested in politics as being a complete blank slate or having no views. Their views are less well organized and less stable than those of people who kind of think about politics all the time or that are highly involved in politics, but they're still there to some extent, even if they're a little more fuzzy. So the question is, what kind of beliefs might relatively disengaged or relatively inactive people have that make them feel distant from, the current ideologically polarized Democratic and Republican parties? And there are a couple of things that could be going on there. One could be, simply that these are people who are very much in the middle across all possible issue domains, whether that's the role of the government in the economy, defense spending, foreign policy, social issues like abortion or gay rights. They could all be just falling in that middle bucket, as opposed to, people on the far left or far right. And there are some people like that who are really sort of true moderates, you might say. And there's a reason why you might expect those folks to feel different. But there's another group of people who are moderate in a different way. And by moderate in a different way, what I mean is that they have very, very left-wing positions on some issues, but then fairly conservative or right-wing
Hmm.
views on others. So, for example, one belief system that's belief pattern that's a lot more prevalent than people who are highly active and engaged in politics realize is that there are a lot of people who really want the government to step in and get corporate America under control, tax the rich heavily, and provide more government services. There are a lot of people who want that, but at the same time are quite socially and culturally conservative in various ways. They might be highly religious. More likely, they tend to be what you might call nationalistic, or they're uncomfortable with immigration, changing population demographics, and they want a lot more uniformity. So these folks might want the government to kind of step in and economically protect the little guy, but only if the little guy looks like us, speaks our language, has our religion, or something like that. So, for example, this is the paradigmatic person who, wants, Medicare for all and high taxes on the rich, but wants all illegal immigrants to be rounded up and deported en masse. So there are a lot of people who think like that, or at least more than folks who are uniformly liberal or uniformly conservative realize. So the question is, how do those people fit their beliefs into a system where you have a uniformly liberal Democratic candidate or a uniformly conservative Republican candidate? And the question is, sometimes they have trouble. And there's some evidence that folks like that are less likely to be politically engaged. And I actually did some work on that, several years ago with some of my students. So we found that, people who are politically left wing or who identified with the political left, but who are also what we call authoritarian. They want rigid social norms. They want everyone to agree about everything, and they want people with very different viewpoints or cultural values to kind of be excluded. Those people tend to be disengaged from politics in a variety of ways. And it's because, their viewpoint, their particular pattern of beliefs is not really well represented at the level of formal political choices.
Yeah, I imagine it's hard to find a mix of a candidate like that in today's politics.
Now, the
So
thing I would add there is that sometimes that can break through. So some of the analyses that were done of the 2016 Republican primary, when Donald Trump kind of came out from out of nowhere and won, despite being this, so, celebrity who had no experience in politics and really not terribly well-formed beliefs. One thing that some analyses of Republicans at that time found is that, well, if you look at Republican voters versus Republican politicians and activists, at least at that time, what you could find is that within the Republican voting public, there were a lot of people who were more economically liberal. That is, they really didn't want the government to touch Social Security or Medicare, whereas a lot of Republican leaders saw those as entitlements and wanted to cut them. And there were also a lot of people in that bucket who, at the same time, really didn't like immigrants. Not just
Okay.
illegal immigrants, but immigration in general. They felt like it was changing the nature of the country. At that point, a lot of Republican elites were relatively pro-immigration for a variety of reasons. Even if you think back not so long ago to the George W. Bush years, George W. Bush, at least relative to what we're used to for a Republican president now, or a Republican leader now, was relatively pro-immigration and tried to take some steps in the direction of reform. But there were a lot of people in the Republican mass public who didn't want that. And to some extent, Trump is thought to have kind of benefited from that in various ways. So, unlike just about every other Republican candidate that ran in 2016, Trump said very explicitly, I'm not going to cut Social Security. I'm not going to cut Medicare. And that kind of gave people the impression that he was a more economically liberal, or at least a less economically conservative Republican. Now, when he got into office, of course, his key policy accomplishment was just providing a huge corporate and upper class tax cut. So take it with a grain of salt. The other thing he did, or the other way in which he kind of stood out from the Republican pack in 2016, was that he didn't mince words about the immigration issue. He gave a much more restrictionist, nationalistic, and ethnocentric take on immigration than most, even the other fairly conservative candidates were giving. So in some ways, he's thought to have filled a niche within the Republican Party of people who kind of were being neglected by Republican leaders up to that point. So people who didn't necessarily want to cut government to the bone, like a lot of Republican leaders did at that time, but they did want to kind of get all the outsiders out of the way.
Yeah. So do you think that some of those people that were engaged that kind of felt motivated to take part in the system a little bit more because of Trump, do you think these are people that are going to stick with him and for this next election cycle, or do you think these people are kind of all over the place a little bit and may not be interested in following?
Well, this is one thing that we've actually had a lot of trouble, getting, a good empirical grip on. And pollsters, in particular, have had a lot of trouble with this. So, in some ways, the 2016 and the 2020 presidential election results, they turned out a little bit different than, polling had suggested. And part of the reason for this is that, or at least the way it's understood now, is that when he's on the ballot, Trump does seem to activate a kind of low engagement or low information voter, so to speak, that's hard to poll and that doesn't respond to standard opinion polls. So that kind of makes the business of measurement and prediction a little bit more difficult. Um, One consequence of that is that there's been a bit of a reversal. It used to be that Republicans really had an advantage among what we call high propensity voters, people who were well off, tended to be more educated, and what have you. They tended to show up more, and they often were inclined to be Republican. And so, for this reason, for a long time, you saw Republicans having an advantage in relatively low turnout elections, like midterm elections. That's kind of changed because of Trump in some respects, or at least we think. One is that a lot of those high engagement, high propensity voters really do not like Trump. They find him uncouth and scary. And so, among some of the most reliable, consistent voters now, there's a relatively strong anti-Trump bent. But among voters who are less active, Trump is perhaps, there's sort of a reservoir of potential Trump support there. But the thing is that with those people that Trump does seem to activate, or at least a subset of them, they're inconsistent. They don't reliably show up. They tend to show up more, they're more likely to show up when he's on the ballot, but in general, they are voters who are less consistent and for whom voting is less of a habit, as I characterized it earlier. So it's really
Yeah.
kind of anyone's guess what will happen at this point, and how that's going to play itself out in the future. And there are all kinds of things that can happen. There are current controversies about whether Biden is going to stay in or not, or about his fitness to continue. But putting that aside, there are also uncertainties hanging over Trump. It seems like it's not certain, but it seems like he will eventually be sentenced for his conviction in the New York trial, the hush money trial, at some point during the height of the election season. It's kind of been deferred to early September, but if that happens in the middle of the height of the presidential campaign, even people who are less informed are going to pick up on that, and they're going to see it. They're going to see, President Trump sentenced to house arrest or sentenced to jail or something like that. And, that could break through and discourage a lot of people who are generally not habitual voters to begin with. But we'll have to see.
Yeah. So, I mean, as a political psychologist, then are these some of the hardest elections to really pinpoint what people are thinking because it's such a weird, I guess, political cycle compared to, past generations of elections.
Yeah, there's some difficulty. I wouldn't place myself in the category of people who think that polling is just straight up broken or
Right.
useless, or anything like that. I think you are getting some good information from polling, or at least good polling, particularly about changes in sentiment over time. Whether or not you've got the correct, what we call point estimate, is, somewhat different matter. And there, things, are complicated in this era. One thing that, is sort of a topic of much discussion among people who do polls is that response rates are much lower than they were 20 or 30 or even 5 years ago. So what that means is that when you're telephoning people, either on cell phones or landlines or through the internet or what have you, you have to contact a lot more people before you get enough of them
Mm,
who are willing to actually answer the survey. And then you have to ask, well, once you've gone through that, funneling process, are those people that you've picked up representative of the population at large? And once, response rates go down like that, that problem of all the things you need to do to make sure your sample is analyzed in a way that makes it look representative becomes more of a challenge. So that's sort of a problem that everyone's facing now. Right now in the election, I would say there's also kind of an element of fatigue. At this point, it's still kind of early before November of 2024. You're finding a decent number of people who are number one, kind of uncommitted, entertaining voting for third party candidates, or just generally asking themselves, why do I have to choose from these two guys again? Those are not everyone, but there's a number of people who are kind of looking at it that way. And when you have that sort of dynamic going on, the measurement process can be a little bit more difficult.
yeah. No,
So I
yeah,
would say
that,
not impossible, but a little bit more difficult.
right, right.
The key challenge of polling is, or one of the key challenges isn't just, do I have a representative sample of the population, or can I weight that sample I do have in a way that makes it reflect the broader population? But another question is, how do I know who's actually going to show up and vote? How do you do modeling of who is going to be a quote unquote likely voter? And that's an additional challenge, figuring out exactly who's likely to actually show up. And that's where a good deal of uncertainty comes in, especially when you're talking about some of the people we've been talking about, these less habitual voters, voters who are less engaged, and what have you. Those people, the behavior of those folks is harder to predict. And there's a
Yeah,
lot more noise in those predictions and a lot of different things that could happen to make them go the other way.
right. And I suppose even, when the people that are taking part in a poll, how you phrase a question to them can make a difference in terms of how they answer as well. Like I've noticed some poll that came out fairly recently, which I had trouble making sense of because they almost seemed contradictory to a certain extent. It said that like you know, most voters think Trump would do a better job of protecting democracy, but at the same time think he's the bigger threat to democracy than Biden. And I was like, okay, well, there must be something about how people are thinking like protecting democracy means, like from external threats instead of internal, or what are we talking about here? So
Well, when you ask a question that's phrased as broadly as who will protect
yeah,
democracy best, you have to ask, well, what are different people thinking of as threats to democracy? For,
right,
sort of a reasonably well-informed Democratic voter, or even a Democratic voter that's, doesn't live and breathe politics. They know enough to know about January 6th. They know enough about Donald Trump trying to kind of get around the result of the 2020 election. So, and they know about a lot of Trump's other sort of authoritarian steps.
sure,
So, when they're asked about it, that's partly what they're responding to. But what about Republican respondents? There's no reason to assume that they're thinking about the same things when they answer who's going to protect democracy more. They're probably not worried about January 6th or whatever sort of authoritarian things Trump has promised to do, but they are receiving a lot of signals that suggest that that elections are rigged, that people are voting illegally, that there's been this or that form of skullduggery by election officials to kind of block the voice of Trump voters and what have you. A lot of that stuff's out there in the communication ecosystem, and it's easy to kind of shoehorn those sorts of ostensible concerns into being concerned about democracy.
yeah. Do you think then that, when it comes to the political system, we've talked a lot about people that just feel like they just don't trust the system at all. Um, is this a generational thing? Has this always been the case to a certain extent? I imagine it has a little bit at least. But also, like, how much is it just like the political system in general kind of breeds this type of dissent due to things like, gerrymandering, or the fact that we have, only really 6 states that seem to actually matter in this election cycle when we based on the polling data that we have. What role does that play in people's minds?
Well, there are a lot of parts to this. One is just sort of the long-term trend. One of the key observations about trust, particularly trust in government, trust in other people, trust in the system, is if you look from about the beginning of scientific polling, so from roughly the end of World War II up through the early 70s, you find that on average, Americans are fairly trusting. And that's a time of sort of a relatively unfragmented media environment, parties that were less at each other's throats. Now, you don't want to kind of present that as too romantic a thing, because prior to the 1970s, one thing the two parties agreed to a greater extent is that it was no problem if certain groups of Americans didn't have civil rights.
Right.
And then finally, the parties divided on that, and the country's better off because it has taken steps in the direction of becoming an inclusive democracy. But up to that point, you do see a relatively high level of trust. Um, After the 1970s, after Vietnam, or after the early 1970s, excuse me, after Vietnam, after Watergate, you really do see this large drop in trust. And that's one sort of long-term thing that's happened over the entirety of my lifetime. Another thing is kind of the comparative aspect of it. Not all nations have the same sets of political institutions. In some ways, the American political system is very demanding in the number of judgments and the complexity of the judgments people have to make. So think about, the election that was just held last week in the UK. Basically, people are making one key decision. They vote for a member of parliament, and there are about three easily recognizable options. The top being the conservatives, the Labor Party, and the Liberal Democrats. But that's the one main thing they're doing. Here, you have to vote for president, you have to vote for a member of Congress, you have to vote for a senator in many cases, and then there are a whole bunch of local and state offices. That's a lot of decisions, and that reflects kind of the federal nature of our system. But just, the sheer number of offices, the separation of powers, and what have you. So that asks a lot of people. And it kind of makes decisions more structurally difficult for people than if you're basically making a simple vote between this party or that party in a single election that determines the government that has, most control. So, that's a factor that can lead fewer people to be engaged. And there is some evidence that, systems that are more parliamentary in nature, like you would have in the UK, or that have what we call proportional representation, which is not the UK, but other European systems where, the composition of the legislature matches the composition of the vote across different parties. That folks in those systems are a little bit more engaged. They are higher rates of voting and what have you. So, those are factors that can make a difference. Voting is difficult because of the nature of the decision. But the other thing that's worth considering in the context of thinking about the United States is, well, how difficult is it to become qualified to be a voter? In a lot of places in the world, voter registration is pretty much automatic. You get stuck on the rolls when you hit a certain age. And there are sometimes things that go along with that, like, a national ID system, which will make people squeamish in the United States. But it's a lot more automatic. Here you have, at least in many places, not where I live, but in a lot of other places, you have to go through a lot of active steps to get registered, to produce ID and things like that. And while there's a lot of debate about how much those additional steps push people away from voting, it takes a lot, there's work involved that doesn't necessarily have to be there based on how, other systems have chosen to deal with this. So part of it is kind of long-term changes in how American, trust in government in America and what have you. Other changes kind of reflect differences between jurisdictions or countries or what have you in terms of how easy it is to make your actual voting decision and how easy it is to actually get ready to participate in the sense of being registered and qualified to vote. The last thing I would kind of talk about under this heading is, well, age differences, or to use the more appropriate term, cohort or generation differences. Right now, there is a lot of disillusionment among young voters. I wouldn't necessarily blame them for that, but that manifests itself, in a number of different ways. Very low trust, a sense that the major political options aren't good ones that necessarily fit their beliefs. A sense that, no matter what choice they make, it's not going to fix the problems that, matter the most to them, whether that be, say, the availability of housing, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or something like that. So right now, what we're seeing in the emerging group of voters that's, sort of complicating our ability to make a prediction about the 2024 election is that, there are a lot of disillusioned young voters whose, votes are up in the air, even when their general ideological profile might lead you to expect that they were going to prefer one party or the other. So a lot of younger voters have relatively socially and culturally liberal views. They're more comfortable with diversity. They're more, socially liberal. They're less religious. These are all things you would expect to push them in the direction of voting for the Democrats or left-leaning parties. But what you're seeing is kind of, a hesitancy to commit in some respects.
Yeah. Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, it kind of sounds like the voters a little bit that Trump had engaged in 2016, where they're kind of a little hard to sort of pinpoint what their thinking is, which is surprising because I thought, in 2020, it seemed like younger voters, it's kind of obvious of what their thinking was in terms of how they would vote. Um, so do you have any insights into how you think certain voting populations or non-voting populations, whether they decide to vote or not, what groups would you say are going to be the most impactful in terms of swinging the election one way or the other, given, the polling suggests, at least at the national level, that it's fairly tight race. So,
Yeah. It's really kind of hard to tell at this point simply because of, this question of, you know, what are the lower propensity voters going to do? They're harder to predict whether it's hard to predict whether they're going to vote for the Democrat or vote for the Republican. So a lot of the question is like, how high is turnout going to be? I think one sort of generalization I would be somewhat comfortable making at this point is that if turnout is relatively low, and the people who are not participating are these people who kind of feel disillusioned or kind of blocked out of the system, or just that their views aren't represented. Then I think if that happens, Biden's chances are a little bit higher, simply because of this pattern that over recent years, high propensity voters have been sort of trending Democratic.
mm,
If folks who are kind of up in the air, so to speak, or haven't made up their mind, just don't vote, then, that kind of eliminates some of that uncertainty. But if they do vote, then, you kind of wonder, what's going to happen there. And for the groups that are less committed at this point to either Trump or to Biden, or dislike their overall choice, I don't know what's going to happen, or I don't feel comfortable making any kind of point prediction, so to
yeah,
speak. They could not turn up. Some people who might have had a propensity to vote for Biden might decide to switch to Trump for whatever reason because of their level of discontent. I don't know if that's going to happen. Or they might decide to leave it blank and vote for other candidates or other offices, so to speak. Or they might vote third party. I don't
yeah.
know.
Wow. Well, high drama, I guess, then on election night in terms of what's going to
I mean,
happen.
I'm very, given the level of uncertainty that exists right now and just the sort of general flux of events that are going to affect the structure of the choice, whether Biden stays in or leaves, what happens to Trump legally, whether Trump, does something very unpredictable again or says something absolutely ridiculous that reminds people that he's, kind of unpleasant, that's anyone's guess. So
Yeah. I
all I'll say
imagine.
is that it's very close. And if you believe the polls, it's closer than it was either in 2020 or 2016.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I imagine if there are people out there that are betting on the election, there could be a lot of interesting bets made, a lot of money be made, given how much is uncertain at this point. So, wow. And so, what are you currently working on then?
Most of what I do right now focuses on when certain personality traits are associated with political preferences. So, there's a line of research in psychology and also in political science that suggests that people who hold certain personality traits are more likely to be liberal. Others who hold different traits are more likely to be conservative or Republican or what have you. A lot of the research that I do with my students is kind of focused on determining what conditions those relationships pop up under. What I've generally found is that, like, for example, we find that people who have a greater need for certainty tend to be more likely to vote Republican, whereas people who aren't as worried about certainty, they're more likely to vote Democratic. What my students and I have shown in a lot of cases is that's really not predictive for everyone. Those traits, they aren't predictive for everyone. It really kind of depends on what sort of signals you're getting from leaders about the differences between the parties. It also depends on, how much attention you pay to politics and, things like that. So that's a big part of what I'm working on. My students and I all have also been working on constructing measures of what political scientists call affective polarization. Affective polarization is this situation where people really dislike members of the other party or just the other party in general. And typically that's been measured simply by asking, both Democrats and Republicans, do you like the Democratic Party? Do you like the Republican Party? Would you want your daughter to marry a Republican slash Democrat or your son to marry a Democrat slash Republican? Things like that. In the work we're doing, we think the measurement needs to be more rich. And, our argument is that if you want to pinpoint who has an affectively polarized view of party competition, you have to look for the people who see members of the other party as completely alien or different, people who have a strong dislike of members of the other party and want to avoid them socially. And you have to look for the people who connect their partisan views with their deepest moral values or their beliefs about the difference between right and wrong. That is, people who moralize partisan differences. So we've been working on a survey instrument or a questionnaire measure that assesses those three aspects of things. And we've come up with a relatively decent measure, and we're hoping to get it out there soon. But that's a big part of what I'm doing work on right now. And that, of course, ties into this general question of, what are the nature of American political divisions? Are they stronger on one side or the other? How does this relate to things like engagement, willingness to deviate from the norms of democracy, and what have you?
Yeah, that's super interesting. And what's the best way then for people to follow your work?
That's a good question. I'm no longer on Twitter. Um,
Okay.
I have a Blue Sky account.
Okay. Sure.
So I try to publish or I try to make announcements about my work on there.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing all your knowledge about this topic that is really hard to wrap your mind around given the complexities of it. So I appreciate you kind of breaking it down for us.
All right, no problem at all. Thank you
All
for
right.
having me.
I'm going to